Despite a recent wave of reactionary pushback, criminal legal reforms have taken shape in dozens of states. The United States' long culture of runaway incarceration is beginning to shift away from reflexive mass incarceration to something slightly less horrific and violent, albeit very slowly. And as we make this transition, the most common question reformers and prison abolitionists get is, what other option do we have for people who do bad things other than throwing them in jail? This is a logical and fair question, and one, if we're going to radically reduce our jail and prison population, reformers and abolitionists need to address head-on. To answer it, we must paint a picture of a different world, one based on restorative justice and reducing aggregate harm while still building robust systems of accountability. Today we're going to try to convince you why alternatives to incarceration should matter to you, not just on moral terms, but on practical ones as well, why it's in your own best interest. In other words, we're going to explain to you when it comes to creating a justice system not built on putting people in cages, why you should care. On this topic, you may be thinking, we need to respect the wishes of victims. They want to see people in jail, and that's all that matters. This is a very popular assumption, one reinforced by television and film, but one recent survey shows it's not really based on fact. A 2016 poll by the Alliance for Safety and Justice, a nonprofit group aiming to replace over-incarceration, found that nearly 70% of survivors of violent crime believe people who commit crimes should get alternatives to incarceration, such as community supervision and treatment. Another study from the nonprofit reform effort Common Justice found that when given an option, 90% of survivors in their program pick alternatives over incarceration for people who harmed them. The idea that victims of violent crime want incarceration is because thus far, incarceration is the only form of justice offered to them. But an emerging field of criminal justice says this isn't the only way. You may follow this by saying, okay, so what does another system look like? First and foremost, we must talk about crime prevention. Much like our current American healthcare system, we direct the bulk of our resources on back-end fixing, in this case, punishing people, than we do in making sure the problem doesn't arise in the first place. The literature is fairly clear that the single most effective way of reducing crime is by preventing it in the first place. It's important to understand that crime is fundamentally not a moral failing, but a social one. The majority of crime can be directly linked to poverty and a lack of access to stable jobs, housing, and healthcare. If a society is genuinely interested in radically reducing crime, the last thing it would do is direct its resources on policing and prisons. Indeed, a 2018 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights found that police and prisons in the United States actually fuel poverty, which itself fuels crime, which itself fuels more policing and prisons, and so on, resulting in a decades-long feedback loop of incalculable human suffering. A moral society would instead direct its resources into creating a robust social safety net that would make economically linked crimes such as robbery, gang-related murder and larceny, drug dealing and possession, and other forms of crime driven by poverty either entirely irrelevant or very much minimized. A call to divest from systems of incarceration and reinvest in Black communities is a key demand of the emerging 8 to Abolish movement and has been a core part of the Black Lives Matter movement since its inception. A 2016 policy platform from the Movement for Black Lives, a Black Lives Matter organization, declared, quote, "We demand investments in education, health, and safety of Black people, instead of investments in criminalizing, caging, and harming of Black people. We want investments in Black communities, determined by Black communities, and divestment from exploitative forces, including prisons, fossil fuels, police, surveillance, and exploitative corporations." The logic behind this is clear. Our cultural impulse towards incarceration is driven not by science or data-based approaches to reducing crime. It is about punishment and control of populations that are viewed as unruly, inconvenient, or surplus. Those populations subject to decades, if not centuries of incarceration, have been making this case for justice long, and they know more than anyone that our current criminal system is not an earnest attempt to stem violence, but a cheaper, racist, harsher way of limiting it to certain communities. You may follow this by saying, okay, sure, we need more programs and support for the poor. But even with all the bleeding heart, root causes stuff solved, there's still evil. What does justice look like even when these systems are in place? We'd still have rape, crimes of passion, hate crimes, etc., no? First off, it's important to note what we're not talking about when we talk about alternatives to incarceration. We are not talking about parole, surveillance, or what's called electronic incarceration. We are not talking about community service, and we are not talking about coercive state-imposed humiliation. We are talking about real, meaningful, restorative justice that both makes amends for past harms while working to prevent, above all, additional future harms. So what does this alternative system look like? Let's get down to brass tacks now. There's a debate in abolitionist and reformist circles about what an ideal alternative system could look like. This short video can't possibly do all the nuances justice, but we do want to highlight one example and look at their findings and what their experimental alternative systems have shown.
I think one of the central assumptions we make in conversations about justice in America is that punishment and accountability are the same thing. We use the terms interchangeably. And at Common Justice, we believe not only are they not the same thing, but that they're in many ways incompatible. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something someone does to us. All we need to do to not be punished is to escape it. Accountability is different. Accountability requires that we acknowledge what we've done, acknowledge its impact, express genuine remorse, make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and become someone who won't cause that harm ever again. You will be hard-pressed to find a prison anywhere that can produce the kinds of results in terms of reductions in recidivism that not only Common Justice, but any number of other alternatives to incarceration are positioned to produce. And that's not just because our extraordinary team does extraordinary work, which is true. It's because prison is what's called criminogenic, meaning it increases the likelihood that someone in prison is likelier than somebody similarly situated who is free to commit more crime. It's because prison is defined by the core drivers of violence. We know that violence is driven primarily by structural factors. That's critical to acknowledge. Prison exacerbates all of them. But even on the individual level, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs.
It logically follows that victims of crimes would support prison sentences for those that transgress them if this is the only option for recourse they've been given, if they're not presented with any alternatives to prison. Of course, between prison and nothing, most people will choose something. Anything to both punish what has been done to them and to prevent future crimes from taking place. But this is largely because as a society, we haven't developed alternative systems of justice other than locking people in cages. Now, obviously, this discussion needs a huge qualifier. That not all victims of crimes want a response other than incarceration, nor do groups like Common Justice, reformers, abolitionists, nor this video presume to speak for all survivors. But what is important is to dispel the myth that survivors of violent crime are a monolith who want a monolithic pro-carceral response to crime when we now have plenty of evidence this isn't the case. What groups like Common Justice, reformers, abolitionists, and this video are attempting to show is that another world is possible. That we can meaningfully reduce the prison population, including those inside for violent offenses, while improving safety, community well-being, and centering survivors. Note too that the moral hurdle alternative systems must clear is not perfection. This is a nirvana fallacy, and no abolitionist or reformer claims utopia is the goal. The moral hurdle they must clear is simply that their system results in less aggregate harm and injustice than the current system. Prison as it stands today is extremely violent. The harm caused by incarceration reverberates throughout families for generations. Prisons are a place of rape, abuse, PTSD, drug addiction. Prisons tear families apart. Money is drained from the community. Prisons severely limit economic mobility, and they lead to higher unemployment rates, all of which, of course, are linked to future criminality. Despite the neat sanitized version we get on nightly news and TV dramas like Law & Order, it's important to understand that the current criminal system is routinely violent and cruel. It's just hidden from our view and not reported on. It's simply factored in. It's what we're used to. But just because we inherit a system does not make it a natural or logical one. For thousands of years, slavery was natural and obvious. For thousands of years, hereditary monarchy was natural and obvious. The primary reason people view our current system of mass incarceration as sensical or moral is not because it objectively is, it's just the way it's always been. But another way is possible. Other societies and activists right here in the United States are showing another way is possible. Yes, it will bring up difficult questions. Yes, it's not neat and clean. But the status quo is defined by racism, class bias, and extreme violence that, as recent uprisings throughout the country have shown, is entirely untenable. We cannot do what's needed to radically reduce our prison population without a sober, evidence-based discussion about who is serving long sentences in our prison and talking honestly about alternatives to incarceration for those who've committed violent offenses. It won't always be a comfortable discussion, but it's one that's long overdue and morally necessary, which is the most important and urgent reason why you should care.